On a cold morning in January 1983, Janet Smurl was doing her laundry in the basement of her home at 328 Chase Street in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, when she heard a familiar voice call her name from upstairs. The voice belonged to Mary, Janet's mother-in-law, but when Janet called back up to Mary, there was no response. So, Janet decided to climb the stairs to see what Mary wanted. What happened next would lay the foundations to one of the most famous cases of paranormal activity and demonic possession in American history. This is the case of the Smurl family haunting. Jack Smurl and Janet Mahosky both grew up in the Wilkes-Barre area of Pennsylvania. They met in 1967, falling in love deeply and quickly, and married just a year later in 1968. As with most newlywed couples, the first few years of their marriage were bliss. Jack served in the US Navy and later became a neuropsychiatric technician at a company called Topps Chewing Gum, giving Janet the freedom to become a stay-at-home mother to their two daughters, Dawn, who was born March 10, 1965, and Heather, born on July 12, 1967. They lived in a family home in Wilkes-Barre with Jack's parents John Smurl, born 1915, and Mary Smurl, born 1917. Janet would say that she had a very close relationship with Jack's parents, often referring to them as Mum and Dad. They were a well-respected, devout Roman Catholic household, and up until this point, life for the Smurls had been happy. They were content and comfortable. They had just about everything they could wish for. But that was all about to change. On June 23, 1972, tragedy struck when Hurricane Agnes decimated the area and flooded their home under 12 feet of water. Fortunately, the family escaped unharmed, but the house was completely ruined. John and Mary attempted to fix the place, but it was no use. The house had been damaged beyond repair and was taken over by the local redevelopment authority. John and Mary decided to purchase a double-block duplex at 328-330 Chase Street in the quiet coal mining town of West Pittston, Pennsylvania. The senior Smurls offered for Jack and Janet to purchase one half of the duplex at a cut price, meaning that their family could stay together. The duplex was originally built in 1896 and was located on a quiet street in a lovely middle-class neighbourhood known for its Victorian homes and tight-knit community. John and Mary bought the house in 1973 for $18,000. They lived on the right half of the duplex, whilst Jack, Janet and the girls lived on the left. The house was in poor condition and required extensive renovations, including repainting, plumbing repairs and electrical updates. The Smurls put a lot of love and resources into renovating the home and spent what money they could redecorating and remodelling the place in an effort to make their new house a proper family home. Now, what the family didn't know at this point was that their new home had already been the subject of local rumours and gossip. Police had been called to the property many times over the years to investigate various disturbances. Strange noises had been heard even when the property was vacant. There were even claims that the previous owners had allegedly practiced witchcraft, and locals reported seeing strange faces peering out from the property in the gaps between the curtains. West Pittston was once a prosperous mining town, but the long-closed mines began to fill with water, causing subsidence among the nearby houses, and in some cases, causing the homes to cave in completely. In one such instance, deep underground beneath the wreckage, many pigs' bones were found buried. Now, I can't find any reasons or explanations as to why so many pigs' bones were buried here, but I've got to say, it's a bit weird. The family quickly settled into their new home, becoming active members of the local community, but were seemingly unaware of the rumours surrounding the property. The haunting began subtly, with incidents the family initially rationalised as quirks of an old house. You know, the usual creaks, groans, cold spots, and the odd knock here and there. But on January 10th, 1974, a mysterious stain appeared on a new rug that Janet had purchased for the living room. The stain only appeared once the rug had been rolled out, and it was still wet with an oily texture. Mary and John cleaned the rug as best as they could and went to bed. However, the stain returned just 2 days later. By February 1st, 1974, tools used for renovation work such as hammers, Screwdrivers and paintbrushes had started going missing, only to reappear soon after in odd places such as the attic or basement. On March 15th, 1974, stains had started to seep through fresh paint on the wall in the dining room, defying multiple coats. Small renovation projects were now becoming huge problems. Tasks that should only take hours were now taking days or even weeks to complete. That same week, much to the frustration of the family, bathroom and kitchen pipes randomly started to burst and leak, flooding the home with water. This is despite being resoldered by John, who was an experienced welder. After remodelling their bathroom, Jack and Janet walked into the room the next day to find that the new sink and bathtub, which had only just been installed, had been defaced with deep scratches and chunks gouged out of the porcelain. Up until this point, the events had been inconvenient, annoying at most. But then, at 8 p.m. on June 5th, 1974, things took a more sinister turn. Jack was alone watching a movie on TV in the living room. He was deeply immersed in one of his favourite nature documentaries, when suddenly, the television burst into flames before his very eyes, causing considerable damage. Other appliances in the home soon started to smoke or catch fire, which could absolutely indicate that there was a problem with the electrics in the house. This wouldn't explain, however, why Jack's car also randomly burst into flames one day. Of course, a self-combusting TV, a smoking fridge, or a flaming car doesn't automatically indicate paranormal activity. However, in 1975, the phenomena did apparently take a turn towards the supernatural. On February 15th, 1975, at roughly 11 p.m, Dawn Smurl, who was just aged 9 at the time, woke from her sleep to see what she claimed were shadowy figures floating around in her bedroom. Describing them as human-like, but almost see-through, Dawn started making frequent trips into her parents' bedroom in the middle of the night, complaining about these figures appearing in her own room. But each time Jack and Janet would search the room, they'd find nothing. Initially, Jack and Janet just presumed that Dawn was suffering from nightmares or night terrors. But, as time went on, strange things started to happen around the home, causing them to believe that their daughter was experiencing something a lot more sinister than bad dreams. Radios and televisions started to turn on when nobody was around. In some instances, when they weren't even plugged in. Foul odours likened to rotting meat permeated throughout the house randomly. Jack said that he remembered lying in bed one night when he could hear slow, heavy footsteps moving across the upper floors of the house when he was very positive there was nobody up there. Being the man of the house, he decided it was his duty to investigate. With a flashlight clutched in a shaky hand, he wandered the upper floors. But, of course, he found nobody up there. Even the toilet in the bathroom had started flushing itself at night when everyone was in bed asleep. When the family were enjoying time together in the living room, they would hear the kitchen drawers routinely opening then slamming shut on their own. Upon investigation, utensils would be found scattered across the floor. Perhaps, most strangely of all, knocking and banging sounds were heard reverberating from within the walls. But when they would try to locate the sound or identify the source, the banging would move somewhere else in the house. Neighbours, including Mary Kowalski at 332 Chase Street, started to complain that she could hear odd noises coming from the duplex at early hours in the morning, when the Smurls were sound asleep. These early incidents documented in Janet's diary set the stage for a haunting that would soon spiral out of control. By 1977, the haunting intensified, coinciding with personal and financial strains. On January 10, 1977, Janet gave birth to twins Shannon and Karen, increasing household expenses and putting more stress on a family that was already struggling financially. One morning, Jack and Janet were woken up by what sounded like a repetitive creaking sound. As they sat up in bed, they listened carefully and discussed what they thought could be making the sound. They agreed on what they thought the sound could be, but desperately hoped that they were wrong. Unfortunately for the couple, they were absolutely right. They climbed out of bed and gingerly made their way out of the bedroom and down the stairs. Jack first, with Janet following close behind. Jack reached for the handle of the door to the porch and turned it slowly. As the door opened, that creaking sound grew louder. Whatever it was coming from outside, on the porch. Jack opened the door and looked out onto the porch, and the couple gasped in horror at the sight before them. It was a cool morning, but there was no wind. With this in mind, there really was no logical explanation for the lawn chairs to be rocking back and forth on the porch with absolutely nobody around. The family had been experiencing the creepy goings-on for a few years now, and although it was unsettling at times, the activity seemed mostly harmless. Although, soon enough, this would of course all change. One night, as Jack lay restless in bed struggling to fall asleep, he decided the best course of action was to read a book. After a while, Jack became sleepy. The inevitable yawns started and his eyes grew heavy. He decided he was now ready to close his eyes and get some sleep. Just as Jack was about to fall asleep, he felt Janet's hand caressing his shoulder. At this point he was facing away from Janet, so naturally Jack turned to face his wife. You might understand the feeling of terror he felt when he saw that his wife was facing the other way, and she was fast asleep. I think it goes without saying Jack struggled to fall asleep for the remainder of the night. One cold morning in January 1983, Janet Smurl was doing her laundry in the basement when she heard a familiar voice call her from upstairs. The voice belonged to Mary, but when Janet called back up to her mother-in-law, there was no response. Janet decided to ignore her mother-in-law, thinking, if she really needs me, she can come and get me. She continued to fold the laundry, but then again her mother-in-law, more insistent this time, called Janet's name from upstairs. And again, Janet shouted up to her. But, again, there was no response. Understandably, Janet was becoming agitated now. She was trying to get her housework done, and Mary calling her from upstairs was just a distraction. So, Janet decided to climb the stairs and see what Mary wanted. Now, Janet knew that Mary had gone out shopping with John, but presumed they must have returned home at some point. So, when Janet reached the top of the stairs and opened the door expecting to see Mary, she was fairly creeped out to see that Mary wasn't there. How could this be? She had heard Mary's voice clearly, not once, but twice. Understandably confused, thinking maybe one of the kids were playing an ill-timed prank on her, she searched high and low through the whole house. Under beds, inside closets and cupboards, everywhere. But Janet really was alone in that house. By this point, Janet wasn't just confused. She was concerned and, frightened. Of course, Janet and Jack had discussed the possibility that their home was haunted. But this was the first time that Janet had really experienced something paranormal firsthand. Not long after this, Janet had a second chilling paranormal experience while home alone. On this particular day, the children had gone to school, and Janet would say that it was a dreary kind of day, as in, the weather outside was fairly dull and miserable. There was a lamp in the corner of the room which was turned on. Due to the weather outside, not much natural light was coming in. However, Janet says that after the kids had gone to school, the weather picked up slightly. There was more light coming in the windows, so she turned the lamp off. Janet made the trip upstairs to make the beds and collect the laundry, along with a few other chores. When she came back downstairs with her arms full of clothes, she was surprised to see that the lamp had been turned on again. Now, Janet says at this point she was doubting herself. Did I turn the light off, didn't I? She wasn't quite sure, so she thought no more of it and turned the lamp off. So now the lamp is definitely off. Janet went into the kitchen to do the washing up. She washed and dried the dishes, hung the tea towel over the rack, sorted the laundry out and straightened up the kitchen. But, as she walked back out into the living room, the lamp was switched back on again. As I'm sure you can imagine, Janet was very unsettled at this point. She doubted herself before, but there was no doubt this time. She had turned that damn lamp off, and she knew she had. This happened 6 or 7 times in the space of about an hour, so now Janet was starting to believe that something was seriously wrong with their house. It was around this time that John and Mary started hearing arguments reverberating through the walls from next door. Thinking that maybe the stresses of family life and finances were taking its toll on Jack and Janet's marriage, John decided to leave them to it at first. I mean, all couples argue sometimes. But the arguments escalated. The voices grew louder, the shouting intensified, and now profanities were being exchanged between Jack and Janet. I mean, they were literally screaming at each other. Mary said she had never heard either of them use this kind of language, ever. She didn't even know they were capable of it. Naturally, John grew concerned for Janet's safety. Not to mention that there were 4 children in the house who shouldn't be witnessing their parents fighting like this. John decided to go and intervene and calm the situation down. So, he walked around to the other side of the duplex. John knocked on the door, and at this point he could still hear the commotion coming from inside the house. But nobody was coming to answer the door. John decided to open the door and enter, but as he did, he was met with a sight that he really wasn't expecting. All 6 of the Smurl family were in the living room. They were sitting there peacefully, quietly watching telly. Now obviously at this point, John was really confused. I mean, he had literally just heard them at each other's throats. And now, just seconds later, they're all sitting there as if nothing has happened. When John questioned the couple, they really didn't know what he was talking about. Nobody had been arguing, and they definitely hadn't been shouting or screaming. They'd just been sat watching TV as a family this whole time. Just a few weeks later, on one cold February morning, Janet once again found herself home alone. She was ironing in the kitchen, listening to some of her favourite music on the radio, when all of a sudden she was hit with an ice-cold breeze as if someone had opened the door to the freezer right in front of her face. As already mentioned, this was February, so it was cold outside. So Janet briefly looked up from her ironing to see if a window had been left open. But when she did, as she lifted up her head and looked up, what she saw standing in her kitchen made her blood run cold. Standing literally right in front of her across the room was the shape of a human figure. But this thing had no discernible features. It consisted of a kind of smoky texture. Not quite physical, but it was definitely there. There was a face, but no facial features. No mouth, no nose, and no eyes, yet Janet knew that this thing was staring straight at her. Frozen with fear, Janet stared back in total shock, not knowing how to react, not knowing if she should make a run for it or stay perfectly still. She was just wishing and hoping that this thing would disappear. But of course, it didn't disappear. In fact, it started to move towards Janet in a slow, fluid motion, as if gliding across the ground. As it got closer, Janet's natural reaction, her survival instinct, so to speak, was to close her eyes and throw her hands up in front of her face in self-defense. Not that I think that would have helped very much against the paranormal entity. But anyway, just as Janet thought this thing was about to make contact with her, it passed straight through and behind her into the next room, as if Janet was never even there. Terrified but curious, Janet ran through to the next room. But this thing, this entity or ghost, whatever it was now nowhere to be seen. In a panic, Janet ran next door where she found Mary sitting in the living room in her favourite armchair, looking somewhat distant, with a slightly glazed look on her face. Now, Mary had recently undergone surgery after a medical scare relating to her heart, so it wasn't uncommon to see her looking like this, but something seemed different. Just as Janet was about to speak, Mary opened her mouth and said something to Janet that shocked her to her core. Mary said, "I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if I'm just seeing things, but I swear I just saw a shadowy figure pass through that wall to the other side of the room." Janet found it terrifying but oddly comforting at the same time to know that she wasn't going crazy and she wasn't the only one who had seen this entity. Up until this point, the activity in the house had been limited to sounds, smells, and things moving on their own. But nobody had been physically hurt. Whatever this thing was, it didn't seem to want to cause the Smurl family any harm. Well, that was about to change in a big way. One evening, Janet was in the kitchen with her daughters, getting ready to go to church. She was ironing Shannon's dress, reciting prayers with the girls and practicing some hymns, when suddenly a 4-foot ceiling light, which was positioned over the dining room table, fell, striking Shannon on the way down. The light hit Shannon hard on the head, causing a gash which required immediate medical attention. The light fitting also caused considerable damage to the refrigerator. When Jack closely inspected the ceiling after the light had fallen, it didn't look like the light had just naturally come loose. The ceiling around the light was damaged to such an extent that it had appeared the light had been physically yanked down with considerable force. Just a few days later, Jack had returned home after a hard, challenging day at work. Janet had taken the girls out to get them some new clothes for school, so Jack took this opportunity to grab a drink from the fridge, then relax on the bed and read a book. Before long, Jack had fallen into a deep sleep, but was abruptly woken up by something. When Jack finally came to his senses, he realised that something was seriously wrong. He was levitating at least a few feet into the air above the bed. Within a few seconds, Jack was released from whatever had him in its grip and was sent crashing down onto the bed. Jack lay there momentarily in silent disbelief, wondering what the fuck had just happened. At this point, the haunting was becoming physical. Whatever this thing was, it was no longer playing games, and things were about to escalate dramatically. One warm night in the summer of 1985, while lying in bed curled up in Jack's arms, about to fall asleep, Janet suddenly felt a force grab onto her leg. She felt it grip her ankle tightly, pulling her from the bed, and Jack recalled that there was almost a game of tug-of-war going on between him and an unseen entity. But Jack wasn't just going to give up easily, yet the harder he struggled to keep a hold of Janet, the harder this thing was trying to pull her away. Eventually, the force subsided on its own, and both Jack and Janet sat on the bed horrified by what they had just experienced. It was in that very moment they realised that this thing could really cause them some serious harm if it wanted to. That night, the couple were tormented by the relentless sound of pounding on the walls, ceiling and door in their bedroom for hours before a rancid stench filled the room, a smell so bad they just couldn't stand it. They had to leave. At this point, the family were living in constant fear, wondering what might happen next and who might be targeted. They felt completely at a loss as to which way to turn for help. They'd spent all of their money renovating the home and rebuilding their lives here. Moving again just wasn't an option. And now whatever entity or entities were dwelling in their home were becoming more intense, more powerful, more intent on causing fear and harm to the family. Just days later, the family pet, a German shepherd called Simon, was levitated from the ground and hurled at the kitchen door right in front of Janet's very eyes. The poor dog squealed as it made contact with the door, then crashed to the ground. Messing with people is one thing, but you don't fuck with dogs. Screw you, ghost, demon, devil, whatever the fuck you are. On yet another night, as Jack and Janet lay asleep in bed, they were suddenly awoken by a huge crashing sound coming from the stairs, accompanied by a scream of pain and the familiar sound of a girl crying. They were absolutely horrified to find their young daughter Shannon lying in a heap at the bottom of the stairs, with absolutely no idea how she got there. Now I'm sorry, let's just take a minute to reflect. I know we say that the family had no option but to stay where they were, but come on, your wife's been pulled out of bed, your dog has been thrown against the door, and your daughter has had a light smashed off her head, and now she's been launched down the stairs. Get your family out of that fucking house. A few nights later, Janet was awoken to find a cloud of smoke swirling around the room. She tried her best to wake Jack. She shook him and called out to him, but her attempts to wake him were in vain. It seemed like whenever this entity wanted to present itself to just one of the couple, it would almost render the other person in a kind of unconscious state. Although the worst of the activity had up until this point been focused around Jack and Janet's side of the duplex, Mary and John were starting to notice more and more frequent occurrences around their side too. In fact, one night when Mary was home alone, she claimed that while she was in bed, her entire mattress levitated off the bed with her on top of it, throwing her to the ground, injuring her leg in the process. The entire family were at their wits' end. Janet in particular became obsessed with researching hauntings, reading books and reports on the paranormal to gain some understanding of what the fuck was happening in their house. On 2 separate occasions, priests from the local churches visited the property in an attempt to bless the house and rid it of any malevolent entities. However, these rituals allegedly infuriated the entity even further. The entity was said to follow the family on a vacation to the Baconos and harass Jack at work, demonstrating its ability to pursue them beyond their home. In the start of 1986, Janet was introduced to a university professor who had a keen interest in all things paranormal. After meeting with the man and discussing her family's current predicament, the man told Janet that although he can't do much to help her personally, He knew two people who probably could. Two people who had dealt with many cases of this nature before, Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed, a former police officer, described himself as a religious demonologist, and Lorraine as a sensitive clairvoyant, with the ability to see that which seems to be invisible. The Warrens were also paranormal celebrities. In 1952 they founded the New England Society for Psychic Research to investigate suspected hauntings including the famous Amityville horror and the Perron farmhouse in Rhode Island. The Warrens investigated more than 10,000 cases in the US and abroad, but they claimed that the Smurl family haunting was one of the darkest cases they had ever seen. The Warrens responded positively and made their way from Connecticut to Pennsylvania. They brought along Rosemary Frewer, who was a nurse and psychic. Their investigation would last months, well into August 1986. When the Warrens arrived at the house, they began by interviewing the Smurls at their own kitchen table. To the Smurls, the interview felt like more of an interrogation, with Ed Warren asking probing questions about the occult, satanic rituals and the Ouija boards, all of which the Smurls denied ever having any involvement with. During the interview, the Smurls talked about many creepy, sometimes terrifying encounters they'd had, and one particular incident took place when Janet was in the bedroom on her own. There was a cupboard in the Smurls' bedroom which had big, heavy, sliding louver doors. Janet said that the doors would often slide open on their own, but these doors are heavy. It takes a bit of strength to slide them. But this would happen frequently. Janet would open the door, and the door would slide closed again on its own. However, on one occasion in particular, Janet had opened the door to put the laundry away. So she's standing there by the bed folding the laundry. The louver door is open, and suddenly it slides shut. Janet walks over, opens the door, goes back to her laundry. But this time, the door didn't just slide closed. It was sliding open, closed, repeatedly. Now Janet would make a point of saying these doors are heavy. You can't physically open and close them as quickly as they were sliding right in front of her eyes. But Janet had had enough at this point, and for the first time she got pissed and shouted, "Will you knock it off? I am not in the mood for you today." And the door stayed shut. Surprised and somewhat happy with herself, Janet carried on folding the laundry. That's when it started again. Open, closed, and again Janet shouted, "I thought I told you to knock it off." And this time, the door did stay closed. Good for you, Janet. You tell that ghost. While Ed carried on asking the family questions, Lorraine and Rosemary explored every dark corner of the house. Being lured by unseen forces towards the Smurls' bedroom, Lorraine and Rosemary were overcome with a sense of fear. Something dark and ominous that wished to cause them harm. When they opened the door to Jack and Janet's bedroom, they were both instantly drawn towards that cupboard in the corner of the room. They shot each other a glance of hesitation, and that's when they were hit with the rancid smell that the Smurls had been describing, that horrible stench of rotting flesh that plagued them every day. Both Lorraine and Rosemary had an overwhelming feeling that something evil was lurking in that cupboard. Instead of probing further, they retreated back downstairs to report their findings to the Smurls. In their initial walkthrough, they believed there to be 4 different entities within the home. 3 were fairly minor and likely responsible for some of the smaller, unexplained phenomena, said to be an older lady who seemed confused as if she had suffered from dementia before passing. She was benevolent and not hugely active. The second spirit, however, was said to be that of a young girl, probably between the ages of 15 and 20. This entity was said to be aggressive and fairly hostile towards the family. Lorraine described her as insane and violent. The third spirit was that of a man who'd been killed in the house. Lorraine said the man had a moustache and was capable of violence, but not much beyond that. In my own research, I read that the man had caught his wife having an affair and killed both her and her lover. He was then hanged by the locals inside the house. However, the fourth entity was something entirely different, not human at all, very powerful, very angry, and entirely demonic. It seemed to Lorraine as if this demonic entity was a puppet master, so to speak. He had complete control over the other entities who served it however it demanded. It was thought that this demonic entity had laid dormant within the property for decades, but something had awoken it, and it wasn't happy. The demons started to feed off all the negative energy in the house like a parasite draining a battery. The more terrified the family became, the more powerful the demon grew. According to the Times leader, Ed Warren said, "The Smurls family are truly a family coming under a visual attack. The ghost, devil, demon, or whatever you call it, is in that home." Although the Smurls had come to accept the idea that they were living in a haunted house, to now be told that they were also potentially dealing with a demonic presence was a lot for them to come to terms with. Ed presented the Smurls with a theory he had about the 3 stages of demonic possession. Stage 1, infestation. That's the classic signs we think about with hauntings. Whispering, knocking on doors and walls, footsteps, and the feeling that you're not alone, which ultimately grows into the second stage. Stage 2, oppression. This is where the victim, and it's usually the one who's the most psychologically vulnerable, is targeted, specifically by an external force, which breaks the victim down and crushes their will, and once in a weakened state leads them to the third and final stage, which of course is stage 3, full possession. And in the Smurl household these stages were well underway. And if you think the Smurls had already suffered the worst of the haunting, think again. The Warrens witnessed some of the paranormal activity themselves on the very first night at the house. The mirrors in the bedroom started to vibrate and shake violently. Drawers started to open and shut on their own, and the television, which had been unplugged, turned on by itself, and in the screen of the TV appeared to be the silhouette of humanoid figures staring straight back at them. The Warrens spent months at the Smurl household, investigating and collating evidence in the form of photographs and audio recordings, although none of this evidence has ever been made public. Which begs the question, why? If you have this evidence, surely you'd make it public. The case was coming under so much scrutiny. If you have proof, show people. I mean, I would. If I could prove the existence of the paranormal, I'd be sending those images to every media outlet in town. Plus, the Warrens really wanted to get the Scranton Diocese involved in the case to have another exorcism performed on the property. So why not present your evidence to them? I don't know. Smells a bit fishy to me, that does. Now, I must warn you, before I continue with the story, things are about to become a lot more graphic. There were reports of sexual attacks. So that's your disclaimer. After the Warrens had left that night, and the Smurl family were once again forced to face the oppression that awaited them, the girls cowered in their bedrooms, and Jack and Janet prepared to get into bed. They discussed what the Warrens had told them that day, and they were trying to think of a way out. Any way of getting their family out of that hellhole. They turned off the bedside lamps and climbed into bed. The room seemed darker than usual, smaller, almost claustrophobic. With their minds racing, the couple were struggling to fall asleep. And that is when they heard it. The silence had been broken by the sound of scratching, and it was coming from beneath them, right under their bed. And just like that, without warning, Janet was struck in the face by something that she couldn't see. She let out a scream, and Jack jumped up in panic, wondering what the hell was going on. But again and again, Janet was struck in the face by this cruel, invisible entity. Eventually, the assault stopped, but the banging on the doors and walls continued through the night. Just a few nights later, Janet decided to try to take a relaxing bath. Emphasis on the word try. She started to feel that she was unsafe, a feeling that had now become all too familiar. The bathroom became filled with the sound of whistling. A whistling that Janet described as sounding like a group of drunken men with sinister intentions. The whistling grew louder and louder until Janet couldn't take any more, and then it just stopped. A few nights later, Jack was awoken by the sound of female voices in his room. Initially, he presumed it was the twins, but as he opened his eyes and looked around the dark room, his vision adjusted, and he was met with the horrific sight of 2 strange females in period clothing standing at the end of his bed, staring straight at him. Jack quickly turned to switch on the bedside lamp, but by the time he turned back to face the female figures, they had simply vanished. A few nights passed by, when once again Jack was awoken by the sounds of the female voices. But this time, something was different. One of the girls in the room turned slowly and eerily to the other, as if whispering into her ear. Slowly, the 2 girls turned to face Jack once more. the stoic expression on their faces slowly transforming into evil, sinister grins from ear to ear. Jack tried his best to scream, but no sound escaped his mouth. This seemed to please the entities, who slowly backed away into the darkness and disappeared into the night. Ed and Lorraine maintained contact with the Smurls on a daily basis, and Ed put forward the idea to attempt to draw the demon out to identify itself. But this was a regrettable decision, as halfway through the ritual, Ed was choked by something that nobody could see. Over the coming days and weeks, bite marks and scratches started to appear on the skin of the family. The marks would just randomly appear overnight. In what he would describe as the most terrifying night of his entire life, Jack was physically and sexually attacked by a succubus. I did already discuss the succubus and incubus in the episode about the ancient Ram Inn. I'll link that in the description if you haven't seen it. I definitely recommend watching that video. But just to keep it brief, a succubus is a female demon that performs acts of a sexual nature. An incubus is a male demon who does the exact same thing. Jack said in an interview, "To be honest, I hate to even think about her. Her skin was paper white, but it was covered in some places with a scaly surface, and then at other places with open sores or something. Now these sores were running with pus. She had long, white, scraggly hair, her eyes were all red, and the inside of her mouth and gums were green. Some of her teeth were missing, but many of the ones she did have were long and pointed like a vampire." Jack went on to say, "She then mounted me in a dominant position and started riding me. That's the only way I can describe it. Oh, it gets worse." He then said, "I don't remember feeling anything at all, other than panic and complete terror. Isn't that horrible? I could tell she was having orgasms because she would give little jerks and her smile would broaden, and then she vanished." Okay, now this is where they lose me a little bit. As a man, if you aren't attracted to, let's just say, the other person, or in this case, the thing, how can I put this without being crude? It's not going to happen. It's just not possible. But that's just my verdict. Anyway, Jack went on to say that he was provoked to talk about the succubus by hosts on various national talk shows, but he felt humiliated. He said he didn't want to talk about the succubus at all. After the initial succubus attack, Jack was attacked at least 6 more times in the same nature. The children were complaining about people floating around their beds at night, and intense fluttering sounds as if a large invisible winged creature was flying around their room. On more than one occasion, the twins, Karen and Shannon, were tossed from their beds like rag dolls, and Jack would enter the room to find them in a heap on the floor in floods of tears covered in bruises. Okay, I'm sorry, but I don't care what financial struggles or restrictions you have. No matter what obstacles are in the way, the second this thing is physically harming my children, I'm out of there. Even if it's in a tent in the back garden. Even in the streets, for heaven's sake. There's no way I'm letting my kids spend one more night in that house. But again, that's just me. I'm sorry, they just annoy me at this point. Oh, but it gets worse. Soon after Jack's assaults, the entity turns its attention back to Janet. Though her experience didn't reach the same horrific extremes as Jack's, she reported the unmistakable sensation of being sexually violated by an unseen presence. Another boundary had now been crossed. One of the Warrens' investigators phoned Ed and Lorraine to report the incident, then played them a recording he'd made inside the house. At first it was the usual, banging within the walls, but then there was something new. Between the thuds came the unmistakable sound of pigs squealing. The Warrens had seen enough. With the local Catholic Church still refusing to intervene, they called in someone they trusted, Father Robert F. McKenna, an old-school traditionalist priest from Connecticut with experience in the rites of exorcism. He was someone they'd worked with for years. But the night before McKenna could arrive, Jack had another visit. Once again, he awoke, paralysed in bed. The 2 ghostly women appeared beside his bed, but this time they weren't alone. A middle-aged man joined them, stepping forward until he was inches from Jack's face. "You will pay for this," the man growled. He repeated it over and over again, as the 2 women watched and whispered, laughing at Jack's helplessness. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they vanished. But the damage lingered. It seemed anyone connected to the house was now being affected. Ed Warren, who had planned to attend the first exorcism, suddenly fell ill and was unable to travel. Shortly after, the Smurl's young daughter Karen became dangerously sick. She lost weight rapidly and burned with a fever so intense her parents feared she wouldn't survive. She recovered physically, but emotionally and mentally, she suffered scars that would last a lifetime. Because what came next crossed a line no parent should ever have to face. Their eldest daughter, 16-year-old Dawn, became the entity's next target. She'd been preparing for a shower when she heard the all-too-familiar sound of banging within the walls. At this point, the noises barely even registered, just another disturbance in a house built on fear. But as she climbed into the shower and began washing herself, something grabbed her arms. Not gently, not playfully. It held her with force, then began to stroke her. Slow, but deliberate at first, and then the grip tightened. Dawn found herself pinned against the shower wall by something she couldn't see. With every ounce of strength, she threw herself past the presence and collapsed outside the tub, screaming for her parents. It was no longer just watching them. It was hunting them. Throughout both sides of the duplex, the family began waking with fresh scratches and bite marks across their bodies. Injuries with no clear origin. The apparitions only grew more twisted. One night, Jack was watching television when he looked across the room and locked eyes with a pale, long-haired man in roughly his 20s, standing silently with a grotesque grin stretched across his face. Again, he vanished just as quickly as he'd appeared, but that smile was something that haunted Jack for a long time. Mary Smurl remained a constant target of the black shadowy figure, and one visiting relative claimed to see an elderly woman peering out from the duplex window, a woman they didn't recognise, and certainly didn't belong there. The Smurls were now at breaking point, so they did what had become their only reliable escape, packed up the camper van and fled to a quiet camping ground in Honesdale, praying for a few nights of peace. Unfortunately, peace didn't follow them, but something else did, and it began on the very first evening. Around 9:15 p.m, Jack was tending to the fire while their dog Simon lay beside it warming himself. Without warning, Simon sprang to his feet, rigid, growling at something in the dark. Jack turned to follow his gaze, and that's when he saw her, a girl, no older than 14, standing in the trees, watching him. Her smile was unnatural, forced, and deeply familiar. She wore an old-fashioned colonial dress, and her eyes locked onto Jack's like she'd known him all her life. She didn't move, she didn't blink, and then she vanished. Jack cautiously approached the bushes, but the girl reappeared, only to vanish again within seconds. Later that night, as the family sat nervously around the campfire, they heard it. The faint, chilling cry of a young girl calling out for help. I mean, what do you do in that situation? They searched the woods, but obviously there was no one there. It became clear the haunting hadn't been left behind. It had followed them. Back at the duplex, the neighbours were growing restless. They reported hearing screaming coming from the house, even though the Smurls weren't even there. One neighbour phoned the house out of concern, only for a little girl's voice to answer. A voice she definitely didn't recognise. When asked who she was, the little girl only laughed. Not playfully, not innocently. She laughed manically, and then the line went dead. When the family returned home, the activity erupted. The black shadow was back, now appearing on both sides of the duplex. Once again, family members began waking in the middle of the night, levitating from their beds. Even Jack's workplace offered no safe haven. Colleagues began to complain of a rancid, foul stench that clung to the office whenever Jack was present. Phones began emitting deafening, high-pitched buzzing sounds. One co-worker even claimed they heard something or someone banging to get out from inside the radio. Then came one of the most disturbing attacks yet. Janet, battling a migraine, lay down on the sofa to rest. But Her peace was violently shattered when she woke to the sensation of unseen hands touching her in a sexual way. These invisible hands travelled up her body, then tightened around her throat. Her vision began to fade to black. Simon lunged at the invisible attacker, but passed straight through it. In a desperate bid to survive, Janet used religious visualization techniques that Ed Warren had taught her. And slowly, the presence receded. The following day, Father McKenna returned for a second exorcism. But, as he drove away, he knew it in his bones. It hadn't worked. Not fully. The thing was still there. Janet's torment continued, night after night after night, often in the bathroom or when she was alone. The spirit seemed to revel in isolating its victims, targeting them when they were at their weakest. One night, following yet another sexually charged assault, Janet saw a new figure at the foot of her bed. An old woman, but this time it felt slightly different. For once, Janet wasn't afraid. This woman, Janet said, felt peaceful, like she was trying to deliver a message. But as the woman moved her mouth to speak, no sound came from her lips. Desperate for help, the family decided to go public on their own terms. They contacted a local television station and agreed to a studio interview anonymously. They were hoping that the Catholic Church would recognise their story and finally act. The Warrens had insisted that while Father McKenna was doing everything he could, only higher-ranking church authorities could truly drive the demonic presence out for good. But this attempt to reach out only further enraged whatever was haunting them. On the way to the TV studio, something unseen tried to force Jack and Janet off the road. Their motel bed violently shook all night. They hadn't slept a wink. The interview went ahead, but the price was steep. When they returned home, the violence escalated even further. Janet was attacked again so violently, she was certain the spirit was trying to break her arms and legs. Then Jack witnessed something new. He woke to the sound of heavy breathing. As his eyes adjusted, he saw something standing over him. He would describe it as an 8-foot-tall creature, bipedal with red glowing eyes, a pig snout and fur covering its monstrous head. Its hands were long and skeletal, rake-like fingers twitching as it loomed. Jack screamed for his life. For once, Janet heard him and came running. But the creature vanished, leaving only a broken man behind. But this wouldn't be the last sighting of this creature. A few nights later, Janet herself saw some kind of entity standing in the hallway. She described it as an evil-looking man with a moustache and animal horns protruding from his skull. The house seemed to be evolving, inventing new ways to break the family. Sleep was now a rarity, and their sanity was starting to dwindle. One night, when Jack went to use the bathroom, he turned on the light, and there it was again. That same beast, standing there, but this time it charged. It squealed like a dying pig as it lunged for him. Jack turned and fled, cornered in his bedroom, pressing himself against the wall. He shut his eyes, praying. When he opened them again, the thing was gone. The next morning, Janet lay in bed trying to rest, when something grabbed her by the back of the neck. A grotesque impossibility. She was lying on her back, and yet she felt the grip. She looked down and saw it, a human hand pushing up through the mattress. But it was their daughter Shannon's experience that finally pushed the family into a new level of desperation. One afternoon, Janet heard Shannon screaming at the top of her voice from upstairs. She rushed to her room to find her curled on the floor, sobbing. "There was a man in my room," she said. "He was taking the things out of my toy box." Janet asked Shannon if he'd hurt her. "No," Shannon said, "but he just stares at me. He smells really bad, and he scares me a lot." That was it. The family and the Warrens made a decision. If the church wouldn't listen quietly, it was time to make some noise. They contacted the press. But once again, the move to seek help provoked violent retaliation. Jack was sexually assaulted again, this time by what appeared to be a young, attractive woman, more human-looking than the previous entities. But her eyes, her red eyes, betrayed her true form. The Smurls told their story to a reporter named Sandy Underwood. They had no idea what they were about to unleash next. In the wake of the Amityville horror, the world was hungry, starving for the next great ghost story. And in the Smurl family haunting, they found one. The media pounced. Headlines ran globally. News vans rolled in. TV crews camped outside the house, shoving cameras through fences just for a glimpse. What was once a quiet Pennsylvania neighbourhood turned into a carnival. Reporters, skeptics, believers, even witches. Literally, a coven of self-proclaimed witches showed up one day, asking completely seriously if they could perform rituals inside the home. The Smurls had gone public in hopes of getting help. Instead, they got chaos. Police had to barricade the streets. Furious neighbours watched their peaceful lives dissolve into tabloid fodder. The children were terrified. People climbed trees at night to stare into their bedroom windows, and more than once strangers were spotted prowling around the property, carrying weapons. Their haunting had become a spectacle, their home a battleground. But just when it seemed like there was no one left to trust, someone reached out. Her name was Betty Ann Moore, a psychic. She offered to help. No strings, no cameras. Inside the house, Betty claimed to sense what Lorraine Warren had described months earlier. 3 spirits, plus one of them that wasn't human. She started upstairs. In one of the bedrooms, Betty said she felt the presence of a large man with a moustache. His name was Patrick. In her vision, Patrick had once lived in the house. He was violent, abusive. He'd beaten his wife Elizabeth regularly, and one day he came home to find her with another man. Patrick strangled Elizabeth and bludgeoned her lover to death. Then Betty turned to Janet. She said Janet looked almost exactly like Elizabeth. And Patrick had mistaken him for the man who betrayed him. But Patrick wasn't the real threat. He was stuck, afraid to move on, afraid of punishment. The third spirit, Betty said, wasn't Elizabeth. It was a woman, younger, hateful, manipulative, and working with the demon that had taken root in the house. This female entity could control Patrick, use him like a weapon. And that demon, it wasn't hiding. It was literally everywhere. In the walls, in the air, watching every move. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, the haunting spread. 6 neighbouring homes reported the same strange activity. Bangs in the walls, noises in the attic, screams in the middle of the night. Foul smells, rancid and unexplainable, seeped through their homes. Whatever it was that lived inside the Smurl house was no longer confined to it. With more attention came more power, and now the Smurls were stuck, trapped between a house that hated them and a media circus that wouldn't let them breathe. And slowly, the public turned. Whispers of book deals and movie rights began to surface. People stopped seeing the Smurls as victims and started viewing them as opportunists. Some claimed the family hadn't gone public on their own, but had been pushed into the spotlight by Ed and Lorraine Warren. Even Stephen Kaplan, a parapsychologist tied to the Amityville case, spoke out. He believed the Smurls had experienced something, but claimed the idea of a demon had been planted by the Warrens, just like he believed had happened in Amityville. A skeptical group asked to investigate. They were given permission at first, but when they showed up, Jack Smurl and Ed Warren met them on the porch and turned them away. The Smurls later said they'd asked the group for help earlier and had been ignored. The group denied that. Either way, Jack made it clear. No investigators beyond the Warrens would be allowed inside. He strongly believed the church was their only hope. But even the church hesitated. Blessings were offered, but a formal exorcism, that required approval from higher up. And many within the church were growing sceptical, especially after the media got involved. The Warrens claimed that they had proof, video and audio recordings, but when pressed, Ed couldn't recall which station he'd given them to. Then, he said it had all been turned over to the church. And then, yet another twist. It was revealed that Jack Smurl had undergone brain surgery in 1983 to drain fluid. Parapsychologists speculated that his condition and recovery could have triggered hallucinations, maybe even mass hysteria within the family. They pointed to natural and logical explanations: old mine shafts under the home, sewer issues, a creepy duplex built decades ago. So what was really going on? Maybe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it started small and became something far worse under the wrong influence. Desperate for answers, the Warrens pushed for a final solution: a mass exorcism. Prayer groups were formed across the town, candles lit, scriptures read, and this time the church responded. The Scranton diocese took over. Father McKenna returned for a final exorcism. The house was flooded with prayer. Friends, clergy, neighbours all surrounded the family with support. And for the first time in years, it worked. The banging stopped. The shadows disappeared. The silence and peace returned. Weeks passed by with no activity at all. But then, just 2 weeks before Christmas, Jack was alone in the living room. He turned off the TV, stretched and stood up to go to bed. And then he saw it, the same faceless figure. That shape, just like Janet had seen years before. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just watching him. It was calling to him. Jack resisted, but the pounding returned. The walls trembled, and the haunting began again. Not as violent, not as intense, but it was clear. The house wasn't finished with them. Eventually, a book named The Haunted and a TV movie of the same name were released. The family used the earnings to finally move away. Years later, their youngest daughter Karen became a paranormal investigator. Whatever had happened had left its mark. And then, quietly, after the cameras were gone, the church is said to have returned for one last exorcism. Since then, the house has remained silent. But, if you ask the Smurls, the real horror wasn't just what happened inside that house. It was what followed them after they'd left it. What do you believe? Were the Smurls really victims of one of the most violent hauntings in American history? Or was it all just a ploy, a publicity stunt, a hoax that got way out of hand? Let me know what you think in the comments section. For more hauntings, click here. Until next time, I'm your host, Severed Soul.